Ben, thanks for joining us on the show.
Pleasure. Nice to meet you, Darren.
Can you just tell us a little bit about your early days as an entrepreneur and take us to the sort of the start as we can sort of work our way through your journey a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, grew up in country Victoria with my mother, and I moved to Melbourne for university. And when I finished a commerce degree, I actually started my first business straight out of university. So that was my first touch with entrepreneurship. It was a pretty simple door-to-door retail consumer business. It didn't exactly shoot the lights out, but I learned a few lessons along the way and decided that maybe a bit of experience in corporate life, or at least in business, would be a good idea. So I went down a traditional sales executive type career for a good sort of 6 to 10 years, various industries and several different companies. And whilst that was going on, there was always a family business that my father and stepmother had bought into and then subsequently taken over that I had interest in, but the planets didn't align in terms of where I was at career-wise, what they needed in the business. But ultimately, at about just around the age of 30, I joined that business, which at the time was a radiology supply business, so selling practice consumables to radiology practices. And I came in to take over the sales function of that business.
Okay. I'll go back a little bit. Were you always entrepreneurial? Was business always something that you were going to do?
In hindsight, yes. It's funny how life can take you in a different path. As I said, I started a business straight out of university, and I thought that was what I would do. I would run my own businesses, and it was always there. And then you get a job and you start working your way up a ladder within an organization. And certainly for a period of time, it wasn't my main focus. But business and entrepreneurship is something that's always certainly fascinated me. So in hindsight, yes, I was always going to go back to it, but sliding door moments, I probably could have ended up doing something really quite different from what I did.
So when you joined that business, your age 30, what year roughly is that? And then what's your progression from there in terms of, because you've had a big exit a few years ago and you're doing some different stuff these days, private investment, that sort of thing. Let's take us through a little bit of that part of your journey.
Yeah, it's a great story. So this is back around the turn of the century, so around 2000, 2001, maybe a couple of years after that, actually, now that I think about it, might have been a bit later. But the family business was relatively small. It was a lifestyle business that we felt it had some potential. But the story of that business was an evolution and a change. Our focus changed 3 distinct times. So from the parents taking over the original business, and there were 4 family members, my father, my stepmother, my stepbrother, and myself, all in that business. And running parallel was a contract manufacturing business that had a TGA license, which is a license to manufacture therapeutic goods. So vitamins, medicines, cough medicines, stuff like that was our business. And through simple external factors, there was a massive company called Pan Pharmaceuticals who lost their license about 6 months after I joined the business, and fundamentally changed the nature of therapeutics manufacturing in this country. And we just happened to have the license that could take advantage of their exit. It's a whole story in itself, them losing their license. But it was equivalent of McDonald's being told you can no longer sell fast food, whole that they would leave in the market. So overnight, we changed our focus from X-ray supplies to contract manufacturing, and started doing manufacturing for some of the biggest brands, consumer brands, and this is consumer health brands in Australia. And it was that process that I started to get an education in that industry, the regulatory framework, the sales and marketing framework. But we didn't have our own products. We were just manufacturing. But we ran that business with what we thought was really high growth for about 8 or 10 years. Subsequently learned later that wasn't real high growth. We experienced that later. But we had one client who ended up becoming too big of a customer for us. They were nearly 50% of our entire business. And so we made a strategic decision for 2 things. One, the customer was too big. And there was always that concern that if we didn't maintain that business, the company would be in trouble. And secondly, that we weren't driving any value into our business. Manufacturing as a contract manufacturer, we didn't own the brands, and therefore there was no value. There was just the profit. And again, it was still a successful, but it was still a lifestyle business.
Somewhat commoditized by the sounds of it at that point.
Exactly. There was and not visible either. So those brands could take that business to another manufacturer. Through circumstance, we had got into branded business. We owned a couple of really small brands that had been offered to us by ex-clients who were looking to get out of the industry. So we had the framework in which we could expand our branded business, but we actually took a strategic decision at that point to get into branded business. So instead of just making products for others, we would launch some brands into the marketplace to try and drive the value of what we were doing. Because ultimately, we were focused on running a successful business with the highest value possible. It wasn't, at least in the early days, it wasn't a purpose-driven organization. It was about a successful business and how can we expand that.
How many years then after Pan Pharmaceuticals lose their license and you guys are now manufacturing, did you then go down that path of we're not just manufacturing, we're a brand? What's the timeline there?
8 or 9 years before we...
Yeah, okay.
And as I said, we were growing at 30-40% year-on-year growth through that 8 or 9 years, moved locations. So we were really comfortable with the business that we were setting up. It was successful, it was profitable, and it probably, had we not made that decision, I would still be running that business today because it was a successful lifestyle business. Would it be worth anything? It would be worth something, but not the possibilities that you can get from running a successful brand with all of the value-added margins.
And this was very clear to you guys when you made this decision that this was the upside, or was it born out of necessity in some respects, or was it a combination of both?
Well, look, obviously we believed in the decision. I'm not sure you could necessarily say it was obvious that was the route to take. And in hindsight, sometimes the best thing is not, if you don't know what you don't know. I now know, and I advise people all the time on just how difficult it is to set up a successful consumer brand and take it to the sort of revenue levels that you need to be desired in the marketplace. But we didn't necessarily know that at the time. It looked possibly easier than maybe it could have been. Again, hindsight has borne out that decision, 100 times over. So certainly the being caught in a situation where you've got one client who makes up 50% of your business, I think that's a real cut and dried decision, that you cannot leave yourself so exposed to having one major client that could destroy you if you lost them.
Yeah. So next phase, and we're talking about, just for listeners to give them some context, the business ultimately, if we fast forward a little bit, it was an exit of some many hundreds of millions, maybe about $700 million down the track. Over what time period from when you start that branded business to the exit? What was that timeline?
So that was about another 8 years from when we started that journey to the end. And the start of that was relatively slow. One of the things that we did, instead of trying to create that brand ourselves from scratch, we actually purchased and went into partnership with another entrepreneur who had started a vitamins brand called Space Vitamins. And that was because he was much further down the line than we were and had done a lot of work in setting up branding and formulations that were skill sets we didn't have in-house anyway. So we thought that there was a great opportunity. Firstly, there was cultural alignment with the business founder, but also it brought the skill set in that we didn't have. We're going to have to go out and hire that skill set anyway. What it allowed us to do was to fast track our development, because he was already at launch stage and in fact already had some products in market. That business was broadly a vitamins business. Funnily enough, the business that we ended up, whilst it was still in the same complementary medicine area, again, through experimentation, through opportunities that presented themselves, we ended up focusing on probiotics, which is a category of VMS, or vitamins, minerals and supplements. And we came into the market at the perfect time, when one single part of that probiotics market, which was the products used to have to be stored in a fridge, and the technology had changed so they didn't need to be in the fridge anymore. So the market leader owned the fridges. We had a product that we could offer to the pharmacists that they didn't need to put in the fridge. So we had a solution that they necessarily didn't even know was a major problem, and allowed us the opportunity to get into the market and to do some pretty novel things in that space that the market wasn't doing at that point in time. And we simultaneously had a second brand that had more global IP protection than Space Vitamins, called LifeSpace. And I preferred the LifeSpace name to Space. It was that simple anyway. So we launched the probiotics under LifeSpace. and they were an instant hit in domestic pharmacy. So we just immediately had product market fit. We had support from pharmacists. The sales were really strong for a new brand, but then we had an inflection point, and that was with the launch of 2 new lines in that range. One was a probiotic aimed at babies, which is literally called Baby Probiotic, and the other one was a pregnancy probiotic. And we launched them at the same time, obvious synergy. And that's when I go back to, we thought we understood high growth, because when we launched those 2 products, we really understood what high growth looked like, because another intersection of market and opportunity, Chinese consumers who had been buying infant formula and everyone's seen the news about how successful that was. There was a Daigou market in Australia who were purchasing infant formula and had just started buying vitamins in particular, were looking for other products. And ours was a product that was an add-on. It was an additional product to selling infant formula. In fact, it was designed to go with infant formula.
Right.
And it exploded to a level that I think is probably unprecedented in history in terms of just how massive that market was and how quickly brands could explode if you got first mover advantage in a category. And that's what we enjoyed.
Before that, you were in Australia primarily?
Yeah, exclusively in Australia. We talked about the possibility for export, but in the early days, we were very much just a domestic market, domestic product.
Yeah, okay. So you've got the foundations there and it's going really well. And then suddenly the Chinese market opens up. And was that something that you, like you say, you looked at exporting, but this is an overnight type?
Very much. It's interesting. There are quite a few people who and companies who are a part of that explosion, and I've been really strong on this. We did not create that market. We did not plan for that market. I'd love to take credit for it. That would be so disingenuous to suggest that we were geniuses who saw this coming. What I'm really proud of is how we took advantage of the opportunity. We were straight on planes to get over to China to try and understand how we could support this market, how we could work through partnerships, how we could do everything that we could to foster and grow that market. And I think we were helped a lot by the fact that we were still at that point a relatively small brand and a small organization compared to the big players.
How does that help, Ben?
A lack of conservatism, and you're prepared to embrace risk. I'm certainly not going to name any of the companies who could have taken advantage of that opportunity, but what I do know is that whilst they debated the merits of somewhat opaque grey market,
you're already there
with 2 arms. So, when you don't have a huge market share, you're probably more ready to embrace risk. When you already are the dominant player or you're a huge brand with maybe global headquarters, you need to think about things, you need to debate them. There are regulatory concerns.
There's bureaucracy in place within the organization itself.
Yeah, I think it's not dissimilar from, watching why large organizations, and I mean huge organizations, are terrible at innovation. They become too conservative. They become too protective of what they've already got. And maybe nobody wants to be the person who suggests, why don't we blow this up? I'm sure through your career in these podcasts, the number of stories around people who have reinvented themselves before they needed to, as opposed to the ones who have watched themselves go out of existence.
Yeah, 100%. And it's being bold and it's having the courage to take on those challenges and those risks that create that. I'm fascinated by the part, I know you said you didn't necessarily create that market, but you did step up in terms of seeing the opportunity. The next part that comes from that is, I imagine, ramping up production.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, we had a natural advantage, but I won't say there weren't any challenges. We were absolutely hanging on by our fingernails because we could not make the product fast enough. And every batch that we would make, no matter how much we'd ramped up, was already pre-sold before it was even released. The major advantage we have over some brands is we were already a manufacturer. So in Australia, I'm guessing, I'm probably making this up, but I won't be far wrong. 90% of the vitamins and supplements that you buy from a pharmacy are not made by the person who owns that brand. There are very few companies who actually make their own product. Almost the entire industry in Australia is done through contract manufacturing. And that's what we were. So we had a manufacturing site that we could prioritize all of our resources towards our own product, that nothing was more important than getting more product out the door. We had in-house regulatory and quality control that allowed us to be shipping things when maybe, typically they'd be sea freighted, to working with regulatory and testing laboratories to speed up every step of the process. Where when you go through contract manufacturing, they don't have the same urgency. It's not their product. So we did have an advantage there, but it was a hell of a ride. There's no question.
You've got control of your own supply chains, or at least more of it than most. In terms of sourcing the raw materials or whatever it is that you need to manufacture, that even, I imagine, was a struggle.
That was the biggest challenge. More than anything else, it was actually the components. So we could handle the human resource side here in the production. Just something as simple as getting glass. We don't have a glass industry in Australia. Trying to get glass manufactured overseas and brought in. We also don't have at that point, I think we've got the fledgling one now. There was no probiotic concentrate market here either. So that our product was coming from the US. So again, ongoing relationship building with the global probiotic suppliers to ensure that we were getting priority. We were able to leverage the fact that we were winning in China. So I'm not with the business anymore, but I'm certainly at the time I left, we were the number one selling international probiotic in China, sold online. So for the manufacturers of the supply chain, we were their potential entry into the Chinese market, which otherwise was quite difficult to tap into.
And so you ramped up from standing start, and over the next sort of 8 years towards the exit, gone through that process of massive growth. When did it become clear that exiting the business was the right decision?
Again, only in hindsight. What had happened was, and I'm not sure if you recall, that Swiss Vitamins had a massive exit out of the same industry. And it was at that point that we realized, okay, we should at least have a look at what our value is in the marketplace, because whilst we were growing, we went for 5 years without growing at less than 100% year on year. So it was definitely an argument to say, why on earth would we sell this business when we're growing so quickly? And to be blunt, I had a number of people tell me that I was crazy, that you should hang on, that what it's worth now, it'll be worth double, triple in 2-3 years' time. But at some point you have to say, well, there's no certainty in anything in life, and the same factors that got us into this might well get us out, or the next hot product comes along. So it was really going through the process of feeling out, first of all, is there interest? And that was very evident very early. In fact, we were starting to get tapped on the shoulder. And I think off the back of other transactions in our industry, we're one of the last privately owned companies in the space as well. So there weren't too many targets, and it was clear that there was an appetite. And look, I've said a number of times since, when people have asked the question, I'm okay with being the person who sold for 700 million and watch it turn into a 2 or 3 billion. I'm not sure I'm okay being the guy who could have sold it for 700 million and watch it turn into worth 50 million. So that was really what it came down to, is at some point enough is more than enough. And we were already at that point. What I absolutely didn't know is that we timed our exit almost to the minute. 2 months after completion, there was a significant change in the regulatory framework of China, and it wasn't part of the trade sanctions that have been announced recently, but there was a change that meant that our business was hamstrung for the foreseeable future, and that's what occurred. So whilst we didn't know that at the time, we certainly didn't know how close the timing was going to be. It certainly validated our decision, albeit after the fact.
Yeah, because that sort of stuff's always potentially a risk when you're dealing with different countries, and you've got, especially when it's one big market that's sort of, like you say, exploded, and what's come about can easily go the other way. And if you look at other industries, those types of things have happened with China, where different things have changed for a dynamic of that industry, and the tap does turn off sometimes. It makes complete sense from a risk mitigation perspective.
We were ultimately purchased by a Chinese company, and BioHealth are the largest vitamins brand in China. So they were also absolutely the right company to take our brand. And they also had the ability then to manufacture LifeSpace branded product in China that can be sold in traditional retail. Now, we had no ability we could only be sold online. So whilst business was absolutely impacted from an Australian point of view, and again, I'm only hypothesizing because I'm not with the business. I would imagine that they've been able to replace those sales with Chinese manufactured product at the time when the regulations were making it difficult for the Australian branded product. And Australian brand product is still flowing through, but Chinese consumers now are more willing to consider Chinese manufactured products than they were at that time. So in a lot of ways, I'd certainly love to think of this, that it was a win-win for both us and for BioHealth, that they got the international brand that they were looking for, and we got an exit at what turned out to be the perfect time.
I think it's some of those types of things, when you make the decision to exit and you're comfortable with the price, it almost doesn't matter what happens after that. And like you say, it goes up multiples or it goes the other way. Yes, you can look at it and go, oh, well, it validated that, or whichever way. But the reality is, if you're happy with the decision, you stand by the decision, and it was presumably life-changing in many respects. And it's a great decision. It doesn't matter what comes after that. It's not really that relevant in many respects. It doesn't impact your life.
Exactly. And, I'd be disappointed if I had any jealousy to see the business go on and be successful, because it was something that we created literally out of nothing. And I still enjoy I still buy the product. I used to get it for free. Now I buy the product. I still love seeing it in store. I love seeing ads on TV. I've got nothing but warm, good feelings about the brand and where it got to.
What was the transition like from a personal perspective, in terms of you go from being a part of the business, and like you say, you started from an idea, and it's many years worth of blood, sweat and tears. And then suddenly, and I don't know what your sort of transition phase was there, but suddenly you're not involved in the same way anymore. And it's a different. How'd you feel going through that process?
Yeah, it was an amazing roller coaster. I only stayed with the business for 6 months after the transition. I expected to stay longer. And even though people had tried to tell me that it might not be what you think it is, until you experience that you go from, for want of a better term, being in charge and making the ultimate decisions, to no longer having the ultimate decisions, and realizing that you've actually got to institute somebody else's plans and ideas that don't always align with yours. I wasn't able to do that. And so for both parties, we shook hands and agreed that it was best for me to leave for both sides. So that change was sort of thrust on me a bit sooner than I had planned. I thought there'd be a longer transition. And for a very short space of time, it was great, because the transaction was incredibly demanding and was the most intense period of my life that I went through. So I was a bit burnt out and needed a break, but I didn't actually have a plan. And so in hindsight, that was a mistake. And I lasted about 12 months not doing much at all, absolutely bored out of my brain and really unsure where I was in life and what my purpose was going to be honest. Albeit, as you said, with a life-changing financial event that meant that we could do some really cool things that we'd been working towards our entire life. Just to compound the issue, though, that year ended in March 2020 when we went into global lockdown. So yeah, there were some challenges.
Yeah, but it's really interesting, because I talk to a lot of people who have exited businesses in my work, on the podcast, and just more generally. And what you're talking about is not uncommon, in terms of you're so focused on doing what you have to do within the business, and then suddenly that transition happens. Often it is longer than that 6-month period, but then suddenly it's very different. You've got to work out sort of from scratch in many respects, like, what's my purpose in some ways? And purpose is a big call, but in some respects it is, right? Because you've just been so focused for almost decades in many cases on building this, and then it's not there. And that's psychologically and emotionally a really big deal.
Yeah, no, it's certainly something I've reflected on a lot and spoken to a number of people about. You won't hear me complaining about my circumstances. Extraordinarily comfortable where I'm at, and a very happy and content person. But it is an interesting conversation to say to somebody, if tomorrow and then for the rest of your life, you only need to do things that you want to do. You now no longer have to do anything that you don't want. How would you spend your time? And that's a really, really interesting question to ask yourself, is which part of my job do I really dislike? You don't meet many people who enjoy every part of their job. And which meeting do I really want to go to? And if the answer is I don't want to go to that meeting, well, you don't have to. Choosing how you're going to spend your time is a really, really interesting one.
Yeah, I find that part of the equation, if you like, fascinating, because the other stuff, it gets a lot of publicity and it's sort of a lot of stories out there about people exiting, but then it's like, what happens after that? I find that really interesting because everyone then goes on their own solo journey just about to find their next place. And I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I've had a number of conversations about it.
And what was that next place for you? Because you've got a new business now that in terms of investment and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so my focus now is a really small. It's not a fund, a private equity or venture capital fund in the traditional sense, because we don't take external money. So there's a small group of us. There's only 4 of us, and we take Brentecra Investments. We take direct private positions in generally early stage companies, not exclusively, but we invest directly in usually, let's say, startup or early stage companies with an idea of working with those brands and founders to help them get where they're going and then hopefully make profit on the exit. And it came through some early opportunities that sort of almost literally came across my desk. People I knew or people of people that I knew. And I made a few small investments, to be honest with you, more out of boredom than anything else. And then as I went along and I got to the end of that 12 months that I mentioned, I felt like I had a choice, which was I could either do this seriously or completely passively, and I need to find something else to do. I had some people in my network who I was very close to who were interested in that journey. And we all came together, the 4 of us, relatively short period of time. And so what I think I've managed to do, and at this stage, at least mentally, if not anything else, is create the perfect job. We've got 10 or 12 different companies that we're invested in. We get to join in on the most interesting part of their journey, which is strategy, which is culture, which is organizational, human resources, a whole range of the top end things that businesses are trying to achieve.
Taking board positions, Ben, or more advisory?
Yeah, to some degree, and that's an interesting discussion in itself about whether a board seat is what you want. I would certainly argue that if that's the only influence you have in an organization, we've probably not done the right thing. So we like to be a bit deeper than that so that we're actually a support to them. But at least I don't hold any operational responsibility whatsoever. So that's the joy in this perfect world I've created. I don't have need for human resources because we're so small. I get the challenge, I get the interest. Almost all of the companies are happy for as much involvement as we're prepared to put in to their businesses. But if I want to travel, if I'm not available, nothing stops in any of those businesses because there's nothing operationally that's relying on me. So we're having a wonderful time working with the companies.
Have you formulated sort of certain sectors that you're most interested in, or is it still a matter of an opportunity you'll assess it on its merits?
More the latter, although we do, not surprisingly, do have a little bit of a consumer health bent. And that's, there's no question that the confidence that you feel and the ability to impact and hopefully enhance a business. Myself and one of the other team, he came from the old business and had worked in larger consumer health products around the world as well. That's our background. And so I do feel more able and willing to give advice in those companies than maybe generally speaking. And so the other companies, we are agnostic to a degree, but I do try to limit myself to giving the advice on general business principles as opposed to specifics, because we've also learned the hard way that if you're an investor, sometimes people can over-index your opinion. Should it be red? Should it be green? How about I don't give you an answer because I am no more qualified to make that decision than you are, possibly less. But if I pick one, you might do it for no other reason that we're an investor.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. But it's not often that investors would take that perspective. So that's a very interesting and humble approach to investing, where often it's a I know best type. I shouldn't say I know best, but a lot of investors are very forthright with their views and confident, rightly so, in their views. So it takes an extra degree of consideration to take a step back and go, that's my view, but maybe it's right, maybe it's not. And to actually withhold that view for that reason, I find that very interesting.
Yeah, I'm over passionate about that point. I think that
Yeah, okay.
having success in one part of life, of business, of the world, does not make you automatically successful in every other thing that you do or have done. And the hardest thing sometimes to do when somebody asks for your opinion, of course you've got one, is to actually withhold that opinion, because you know deep down, or maybe you should know, that you're not the right person to ask, because it makes you almost potentially look like that you're not up to it, that you're not this guru that I'm hoping you were. But as soon as I said, as soon as you give that opinion, it may actually be less helpful than.
But it's interesting that you say that, like, an opinion is an opinion, but the way that you're saying founders may over-index the weight on that opinion, that's actually,
Yeah.
I can see how that would potentially play out and how it's kind of productive, potentially. If they're the founder and you're backing them, you want them to be able to actually make their own decisions on the merit of that decision without putting the wrong weightings on things. So that makes sense.
That's right. They have to be able to.
Yes. And what are the traits you look for in founders? Having been there and done that, and obviously there's different strengths in different types of people, but what sorts of couple of things that come to mind when you're looking at founders of the businesses that you like to invest in?
Yeah. So that's one of the biggest learn. We've looked at, we're relatively young at this. We've been doing it for, 2.5 odd years. And so we're constantly evaluating which of the investments have worked, which ones haven't worked. And so often and again, it comes down to founder. And I think the biggest one for me is resilience, particularly in this day and age. Being a founder is really hard, really, really hard, and maybe harder than particularly younger people, generally speaking, think that it's going to be. So the ability to just refuse to be beaten in those early days of a business, particularly fundraising, is so difficult at the moment in the economic cycle that we're in. The world changes so quickly. The ability to not get knocked off your bike, so to speak, and just refuse to be beaten is so important. And alongside of that, some good old fashioned hustle can make a huge difference. So it sometimes feels like there's maybe an inability for people to realize that they've got to drive this through hard work, and there might be risk and there might be difficulties, but they're an absolute part of the journey that not only will help you get there, but for those, when you find success, will help you to be a better leader and have empathy for the people working for you as the organization grows.
Those traits of resilience and grit and that type of thing, which I think are fascinating. How do you identify those in a founder, or is it something that you're able to sort of pinpoint in reflecting afterwards? Because I imagine meeting people, looking at the business, resilience doesn't come through the numbers. It doesn't come through a lot of stuff until you actually see them go through the hard times, which probably doesn't happen until after you invest. How do you identify those traits in advance?
Well, we've made a decision internally, which is something, again, maybe a little bit unique to us, but one of the four is a consulting psychology degree, runs a successful executive coaching business and works with a lot of founders, has a pretty significant suite of psychometric testing and the like available along with interviews. We've reflected back and we've used some of those to a degree, not strongly enough, because in hindsight, some of the things that threw up, which we saw them as just mild red flags, we've now realized we could easily now run with experience. We could look at those and say, actually, these are not the people that we want to be in business with. So we've got really firm with ourselves internally that we cannot over stress the importance of the founders in this journey. Good founders will take an average idea and make it successful. Bad founders will make any business unsuccessful. So we're just not going to compromise on those principles again. You're right. It's not easy. It's not perfect. We're talking about human traits, but some of the best testing that I've seen, everyone thinks, I'll beat the system. No, people actually answer what they think is the right answer anyway, and everyone's different. It does come through, believe it or not.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And being able to have, even presumably, being able to have those tests and then reflect back on them in some sort of back testing type regime would give you a lot of data that would be very useful, and the ability to learn as you go and continue to enhance that learning, I would have thought.
That's exactly right. I mean, the nature of investing in early stage companies is they're not all going to make it. Some of them are going to fail. So some of that is just time. You need the ability to go through those stages. And then we absolutely, anytime there's failure or close to, or even just an average result, take the time to reflect and say, okay, can we learn from this? Will this help us better inform us to make a decision going forward, keeping in mind that you can't be absolutely paralyzed by that, because there's always a reason to say no. So at some point, if you're going to be an investor, there has to be some leap of faith in that space, and you're not going to be able to guarantee success. If that was possible, well, it'd be a very different world we live in.
That's very true. I mean, I look at some of the companies I've seen in the early stage space years ago, and I could look at a company, and if I found sort of what I thought was a fatal flaw in the business or whatever it might be, you'd be like, no, I couldn't invest in that. But then later on, that founder actually turned it into a great business because they pivoted and they saw that. And so a great founder will overcome whatever the obstacle is if they're great at what they do. It's a bit like you're saying it. They'll take an average product and make the business great still. And it's really hard to quantify. That's something that's within a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can all do it. You think back to companies that you just thought were absolute guaranteed for success, and likewise ideas that really didn't resonate, and then down the track, certainly, again, I won't give the example because they're actually flying, but one business we looked at, I thought they were insane. I thought it was never going to work, and they've great. They've completely proved me wrong. So you're right. It's not a perfect science, and you have to be okay with some level of failure. But equally, you shouldn't be comfortable with never improving your success rate. You should always be looking to see how can we do this better, and what are the methods that we can employ to try and make the best decisions.
Then what would you say over the course of your business journey was the best or biggest lesson that you learned, that you took away from, if you think back, what's the biggest thing that you learned?
Look, probably more recently, it's probably in this last adventure that I've been on in investing. I can be too optimistic and then ignore the detail or the information that I have at hand that would have saved me from a poor decision. So coming out of the transaction and into this investing space, there are a few investments that I made which, in hindsight, I would never make again, and which is important for the rest of my life. I'm really confident that the mistakes that I made through them, I've got much better guardrails up to ensure that won't happen again. And that comes down to taking your time. You should never be rushed over an investment decision or move on and find a new one. And if there's any gut feel issue that you have, 9 times out of 10, you're absolutely right the first time.
Yeah, I mean, just because you can't identify exactly what it is, you've worked it out, haven't you, in terms of what that red flag might be? But gut decision is very valid in my view. What about things that inspire you? What type of people or companies sort of inspire you?
Yeah, I love people and companies, people who have created something amazing that wasn't there before. Not sure about the individual personally, but like Walt Disney is an example of what that company has turned into. But even a long time ago, before it was the behemoth that it is now, I can't even imagine what it must have taken from a driven and creative personality to create something like Disneyland when nothing like that existed in the world.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So I love those dreamers who won't take no for an answer, who think of something bigger than already exists.
Eager and different, like those 0 to 1 type businesses that just didn't exist before. You can always enhance things, and people do that with different business models, but to actually take something completely new is quite special.
Yeah, it is. And maybe I'm wrong. It feels like it's getting a little bit harder. It's talk about music. They've run out of ways to rearrange notes. The world is a lot more mature, but there's always the next amazing idea. I'm constantly delighted by the world's ability to come up with what's next.
Yeah. Now, I read somewhere that you're an expert in retro video games. Is this true? So my final question here is, what is the best video game of all time? And where does Mario Kart rank?
Ooh, good question. So yeah, I am a video game tragic, back from the old pinball machines and all the way back to Pong and everything in between. I'll start with the second question first. Mario Kart has brought me and my family, my kids in particular, so much joy over the iterations from Nintendo 64 through to the current. And the only disappointing thing is that both of my children are now significantly better at the latest version of Mario Kart. I can barely play with them. Where I have got them covered is in retro games. So for some reason, my son can hand me my backside in any modern video game, but he can't beat my scores in the old ones. And for me, it was Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong. Okay.
It's almost the perfect game. It's got variety, it's difficult, but if you devote enough time to it, you can actually crack the code in terms of it's half memory, half hand-eye coordination. So for me, I'll stick with Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong. Perfect. Ben, it's been fantastic to chat to you. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Pleasure, Dan. Nice to meet you.